No. Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along to this session as part of the EDI Festival. Can you see my screen all right? Should be sharing.
Yep.
Yep. Good, excellent. Yep. It's not the snappiest of titles that we came up with, Decolonisation, Demilitarisation and Democratisation, but it has the virtue of at least conveying the sort of themes that Marius Quint here and myself, Tom Sykes, wanted to sort of address today in this session. The subtitle, Critical Heritage Awareness in Service of EDI Objectives at the University of Portsmouth, is something that will be more kind of Marius's bag. I'm not really a heritage history guy. I'm a sort of literature and media guy, really. But so for that reason, I'm going to tend to give you a bit more of a kind of broad strokes illustration of some of the things that we're interested in and that Marius and I and other colleagues and some students as well have been sort of trying to be sort of active in promoting and critiquing and so forth. So I'll just begin with some thoughts about, well, begin with a sort of anecdote, if I may. It's related to a student who I didn't actually teach, but I had many dealings with through certain projects at Portsmouth University. I won't name him, but he is of British Palestinian origin. And because we had a lot of similar interests in questions around sort of race and ethnicity and nation, world affairs, international relations, things like that, we necessarily had lots of discussions. I think one of the privileges of being a teacher at any level, lecturer, school teacher, or whatever, is what you learn from your students as much as hopefully what you can teach your students. And I certainly learned a lot from him. I hope maybe he learned some things from me. But the first thing that the first sort of conversation we had about these questions of equality, diversity, and inclusivity, which obviously are very central to this festival, this day of events, is that he felt like he didn't really belong, particularly at the university, given his particular ethnic background, his BAME background. He felt that he wasn't really sort of represented. While he had friends, we'll look at some statistics related to representation at the moment in this institution, but while he felt that he had connected with a fairly diverse group of students, peers at the university, he said things like, not many lecturers look like me, right? Which I think is a problem that's been recognized and probably needs to be addressed through policies towards hiring and things like that. But outside of the university and looking at the city beyond, and I know this is something that Marius is going to speak to in more detail shortly, was what you might call the sort of ideological atmosphere in Portsmouth. This is a matter of the sorts of heritage and history that this city has, and how that kind of manifests itself through things like what you might call a martial topography, lots of roads and landmarks named after problematic figures for people like him and people like me, to be honest, as well. Whether these are sort of, generals who, were sort of representing and fighting for the British Empire, or whether it's the case, as it is near where I live in Portsmouth, where lots of the roads seem to be named after these kind of colonial battles. And I do wonder whether there should be, what sort of pride, if any, we should be taking in these things. So the kind of language he was using was that he felt that it was sort of unsafe space, a kind of inhospitable place, because these sorts of names, these figures, these role models, these heroes didn't really speak to him. And I thought I would just quote, I had a typical sort of white boy from the suburbs, like a lot of those people was into Public Enemy, the rap group from the 1980s and 90s. And there were just some lyrics from their tracks that I think kind of, speak to this idea that, in this particular one, Huey Newton, they mention H. Rap Brown, these sort of figures of African nationalism and African-American resistance. that aren't represented on stamps or dollar bills. You know, it's a different sort of, if you like, a canon of role models and heroes that aren't really represented in mainstream society. And I think my student was really thinking along those lines. Just on that point of representation, now forgive me if these statistics might be slightly out of date, because I was in a bit of a rush putting this together, but from what I could find from the UOP staff equality data is that 10.5% of university academics and research staff are BME, whereas 26.5% of UOP students belong to that group. So there's clearly a kind of imbalance or a disconnect there. At the same time, and these were discussions that I got into with my student and other students and indeed colleagues, because this kind of process of mutual learning and dialogue had sort of expanded beyond just me and him by this point. And I started to have some conversations and to really read about and learn about this idea of representation. While it's important, there are also sort of potential dangers with it. It can often be used in a kind of superficial and tokenistic way, and can be a means of vindicating the status quo. And a sort of classic example that I'm going to quote from Kehinde Andrews, whose excellent book, The New Age of Empire, I would thoroughly recommend, came out last year. I would recommend to people. He talked about how on the surface, we have the most diverse cabinet in British political history at the moment. People like Priti Patel and James Cleverly and so forth. And that should be a good thing on a certain level. But the trouble is that when you look at the sort of policies and positions these people hold, many of them have not been very good for people of colour and people from, you know, different backgrounds and marginalised backgrounds, whether this is the sort of hostile environment towards migrants or Priti Patel going on national television calling for the reintroduction of the death penalty and things like that. And to just quote Andrews a little bit more on this, we entirely miss the point if we believe that racism can be overcome with token gestures, commitment to diverse hiring practices, or statements of brand solidarity. So there needs to be, and this is not a new idea, this is not a new complaint. You can go back into earlier generations of post-colonial and anti-colonial theorists, people like Frantz Fanon, who talked about at the very height of decolonisation, when the European empires were being defeated and driven out of Africa and Asia, there was this concern about what Fanon called the native or the national bourgeoisie. In other words, what is the point of getting rid of British or French colonial masters if there will be a kind of native elite who look like the people that they're ruling over? But what is the point of bringing them in if they are going to just continue the same oppressive sorts of practices as the former colonial overlords, you know? So I think all this speaks to the fact that there are complexities even within this question of representation, and that the problems around EDI and trying to improve that situation run much deeper and are much more sort of structural than simply a matter of sort of getting the right people into certain positions of power, I would argue, and so would these scholars. This process of mutual learning went on as my student talked about, you know, this is where his positionality as a British Palestinian, someone belonging to the diaspora, came into play. It also started to make me think a little bit about my own background, which is somewhat different, though related in a sort of complex way to his Palestinian heritage. I have deep roots in what was once a very large Jewish community here in Portsmouth. And so we both talked about the continuities between the imperial past, between these statues and road names celebrating colonial generals and so forth, and what we might call the neo-imperial present, the sort of continuing problems of war and militarism as they affect Britain today, whether we're talking about the Iraq and Afghanistan catastrophes or the Libyan intervention and so on and so forth. We talked about the fact round about this time, we became aware of Priyamvada Gopal, who's a Cambridge University historian, who was making the point that decolonising the curriculum, trying to come to terms with what an institution is and what it means, should go further and should go into that sort of structural, sort of deeper structural sort of direction. And what she managed to do was to get Cambridge University, where she works, to begin to investigate the ways in which that institution had benefited from the profits from the Atlantic slave trade. You know, a reckoning with that as part of this process of sort of decolonizing the institution and making students from diverse backgrounds feel, I suppose, a little bit more likely to feel like that they belong to that institution. Portsmouth is obviously a very different institution to Cambridge in terms of its history and its background and its political economy. But, you know, as I say, with these conversations I was having with this student and with others, we were aware that Portsmouth has this imperial history, but it remains very militarized today. As everybody knows, it's the home of the Navy. It's also the home of a number of arms manufacturers, such as BAE Systems. And as there was a sort of quite a funny moment, but also quite dramatic moment at a spoken word event that I hosted in the university, in the Eldon building where I work, this student got up and decided to, for his sort of performance or his contribution, to start talking about some of the research projects that within the university that had been funded by arms companies. And then he sort of was able to weave that into a discussion of his own background, the very fact that his family had to flee Palestine and come to Britain was not least because, or one of the reasons for that was because of weapons supplied to Israel and to that sort of situation in the Middle East, which created the kind of strife and the violence that drove his family out. So there were, a very interesting connection being made there. Off the back of that, myself and some colleagues made some FOI requests to the university. We found that between 2013 and about 2020, almost £1 million had been received from arms companies, from BAE Systems in particular, I think. And some of us started to think about, well, how does this kind of square with our certain ethical policies that we have in place, such as, this is a quote from our Equality and Diversity Policy Statement: to eliminate discrimination, harassment and victimization, advance equality of opportunity, foster good relations. We also have similar imperatives sort of suggested by our kind of research ethics guidelines as well. So some of these ideas, I want to sort of bring this back to talking a little bit about, I've talked about the dialogue I had with my student, but that also inspired me to try and do some other sort of activities to engage other students that perhaps were not as kind of aware in the first place as that particular student. So I've always been interested in this notion of active pedagogy. It's from the educationalist Jeff Petty. And this idea of we learn by doing through dialogue and interaction. I suppose it's an absolute rejection of the old-fashioned Victorian kind of learning by rote approach, where all the students stay quiet and just memorize stuff and there's no interaction. It's quite the opposite of that. And I think all the teachers who are here, I would hope that you all recognize the importance of engaging students in that way. And also, I've been quite inspired by Ken Robinson, the late, quite recently late, sadly, educationalist. He talked about the learning benefits of experimentation without fear that the student might in some way feel that they've failed or they've given the wrong answer. And so I had this in mind when I started to try to equip my students to think critically about these issues around EDI and so forth. So I invented this exercise called Devil's Advocate, which I kind of modeled on one of those, TV debate shows like Question Time. What I do is divide a lecture theatre or a classroom in half, and I say that's everyone to the left of this imaginary line is team A, everyone to the right is team B. And then I give them a proposition to write down as many arguments for or against, depending on what team they're on, in 5 minutes. It starts off as a writing activity because I teach creative writing mostly. And then later on, it becomes I invite people to speak to each other and to try and argue their cases verbally. The the important thing here is that the challenge here is when a student finds themselves in the team that has to argue for or against a proposition that they personally wouldn't agree with or get on board with. That's where I think your skills of argumentation start to sort of develop, if you kind of make arguments for things that you don't necessarily agree with. So I started giving them statements, got some really interesting debates from statements linking to what we've just been talking about. The University of Portsmouth should divest, or you could say should not divest, from potentially unethical external organisations, fossil fuels, arms companies, inhumane regimes. I do not feel as though I belong to the student body here at the university. I do not feel that I have any say over how the university is organised or governed, which is going to lead me into the sort of final point I wanted to make. Another technique that I've found, and I'm sure the teachers who, excuse me, I'm sure the teachers amongst us here will recognise, will have done something like this, if not something very similar to this, which is this idea of learning jigsaws from Elliot Aronson, who is an American. There's an interesting backstory to this, because Aronson was an American teacher in the 1960s who was trying to deal with recently racially desegregated schools. And he was trying to find ways of encouraging students to work together, students from different backgrounds to work together who maybe had never had that experience before. And I'll just quote from his explanation, because there's nothing like the source material. Students are taught to work in smaller interdependent groups. Each is given a part of a topic to be studied, and when finished, the students fit their pieces of the subject area together to form a complete jigsaw picture. So I would turn this into a kind of research exercise. I'd give the students 30 minutes, 40 minutes to research a large topic, such as the way that their university operates, because there have always been lots of questions amongst staff and students about, this is an institution I spend a lot of my time in. It pays my wages, and if we're talking about people who work here, or I pay into it, and I am hoping for an education from it, if we're talking from the perspective of students. So how does it work? So what I'd do is I'd get one element of the group, two out of the 6 members of the group, to research the question of, how democratic are the sort of governance structures of UOP? How does it work? What's the hierarchy? Who are the board members? Who are the senior managers? What are their backgrounds? Who are they? And the way that this links to EDI is, I think, quite intriguing, and it comes from another scholar who's a favourite of mine, a young British Jewish scholar called Barnaby Rain, who has written some. Again, I would thoroughly recommend his work on anti-Semitism. And his view is that the more unequal and undemocratic an organisation, institution, society, or nation is, the more likely that it will have problems around racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination and bigotry. So there is a kind of holistic way that this works. If you have inequality and lack of transparency in some areas, it will affect other areas too. And again, this might be for many of us kind of self-evident, but I think it's useful for it to be formulated in a kind of scholarly way, as Rain does do. And I'll just end on another quote from Stefan Collini, because I think this is another really important aspect that Marius and I are very interested in. I think, with the best will in the world, doesn't get talked about enough in these conventional discussions of EDI in higher education. So this question of democratization, accountability, and transparency. And I'll give you an example. This is from Stefan Collini, who's, I think, an Oxford Don, who has really done a fantastic job of analysing how universities have changed in the kind of modern neoliberal marketized era. And this is one of the problems that I think, it's worth trying to encourage students and staff as well to reflect on, which is, and I'll quote him, "One recognised expression of autonomy is for academic staff to have a say in who is appointed to the roles of deans, pro-vice-chancellors and vice-chancellors. In British universities, unlike the majority of their European counterparts, that doesn't happen." So again, there seems to be a sort of democratic deficit there, which I think is worth, I'm not suggesting I have the answer for you, but it's worth discussing and exploring, I think. And certainly it's of interest to students when they start thinking about, you know, where their money is going and how they're being represented, are they being represented, and how that actually, how those sorts of processes work within the institution. Now, I know that this seems like a big hill to climb if you are in agreement with any or even some of these sorts of imperatives. You know, I think the question of potentially unethical relationships with external organizations is a difficult one to challenge, because we, as I said, we're in this sort of market-driven environment where universities are increasingly needing to fund their activities by turning to external sources of funding. That's difficult to do. But I think something we do have control over as teachers, as researchers, is the way that we teach and the way that we do research. We have control in the classroom. We still have a reasonable amount of autonomy, to use Collini's word, which might allow us on a kind of small scale, at first anyway, to start to build back what Terry Eagleton, the literary critic, calls centres of humane critique, which is what universities used to be. That's the sort of classical liberal humanist idea of what a university is, that it tries to challenge power and received opinion and dominant ideologies rather than align with it. You know, that anyone in a university should be thinking critically about everything, really, that university themselves, the wider society. And I think, yeah, there are things we can do through these sorts of forms of pedagogy and activities with students and these sorts of dialogues that can hopefully allow us to facilitate, yes, that kind of critique. Anyway, that's enough from me, and I will hand over to Marius now, while I still have a voice left. Excuse me.
Thank you, Tom. That was remarkably fluent, and mine will be a sorry act that follows this, but I'm far less prepared. But to pick up on some of the ideas that we have been discussing, including sort of trying to recuperate some of the history of Portsmouth, and in particular military history as well. I trained as I did my doctorate in 18th and 19th century popular theatre history, specifically circus, which at the time was a surprisingly militaristic affair, because many of the key equestrians who founded the modern circus, namely Philip Astley in 1768 at a site near Waterloo, the present Waterloo Station, and St Thomas's Hospital, was an ex-cavalry sergeant who'd sort of earned his spurs in the 7 Years' War with the French and sort of colonial enterprises. And there was the very strong overtones of loyalism, of anti-Jacobinism in opposition to the democratic ideals of the French Revolution, and frequent sort of military reporting on conflicts abroad during the French Revolutionary Wars and subsequent Napoleonic Wars, and later on colonial wars. So the storming of Seringapatam in the 1850s would be dramatized on the stage, the siege of Valenciennes in the late 1790s, and so on. So the circus wasn't just about performance, it was also about sort of almost like an action movie stage, and there was a stage attached to it. The reason for me citing this is because if one views that kind of history and the history of popular entertainment at the time, where these kind of very strong overtones of military loyalty were running, one gets the impression that everyone was of the same opinion, but and that there was this kind of universal approbation of loyalty amongst the mixture of the working and the middle, and to some extent upper classes who patronised the popular theatre on the South Bank of London. However, if one looks a little bit closer at the actual history of the military in Britain, one finds out that it's not quite so uncontroversial a topic, and indeed it was deeply unpopular at many periods in its history. And Portsmouth being no exception to this, albeit that Portsmouth was essentially and remains a naval city. It was established, as a naval base, mainly under Henry VIII, as we know, and then grew in particular, grew fat under the, or prospered, shall we say, in particular during the French, the wars of the 1770s to the early 1800s. The kind of period that I was studying in my doctoral thesis. For example, there was a satirical tract written in 1797 when disaffection, and I've been looking at some rather interesting papers, the Portsmouth papers, which were published during the 1960s and 70s, based on research in the archives here at Portsmouth, and you can buy them for, I think, 75p at the City Museum. And in 1797, when disaffection, this is one written by Alastair Geddes, Portsmouth during the Great French Wars. In 1797, when disaffection with the war with France was widespread, it was said, Earl Fitzwilliam, who patriotically, humanely, and very wisely proposes to carry on the war until France again becomes a monarchy, is the popular toast among the slop sellers, publicans, and gin dealers, etc., of Portsmouth Point and Gosport Beach. If his lordship's sensible advice is adopted, there can be no doubt that many of these respectable characters, before the contest terminates, will have acquired sufficient property to command a seat in the upper house of Parliament. And then, by contrast, in 1788, a press comment read, everything at this port wears the appearance of a long continuance of peace. The shipwrights in the dockyard were on Wednesday last reduced to a day and a tide, the rope men to a day and a half. So the idea of Portsmouth's economy being intrinsically tied up with the Royal Navy and profiting from imperial warfare is sort of deep laid in the city. However, it is possible to recuperate, I think, histories of the kind of challenging of authority and power structures that Tom mentions, which is, and if in terms of teachable moments, I think if we sort of teach a sanitized, if you like, version of those histories, which exclude kind of popular resistance to press gangs, to the abuse of sailors, mistreatment, the constant arrears in pay, and which required many sailors' families to go to call upon the poor law and to go on the parish for years going without pay, and lack of shore leave, the persistence of terrible food, floggings, and so on. And indeed disease and death. I mean, for example, between 1770 and 1780, 174,000 men were recruited into the Royal Navy, and of those, more than 10% died in the process of that approximately 10 years. So the mortality rates on board ship were very high. And so Portsmouth had this kind of history of oppression, of official, and very brutal reprisals, for example, to the not so much the famous mutiny of Spithead, which was in 1797, but certainly to the mutiny of the Nore, in which 19 of the mutineers were hanged, and in other cases, numerous mutinies, over 9 in the period between 1780 and 1800, over 9 sort of mutinous episodes, in which the reprisals include mass hangings, up to 11 hanged on different ships in the harbour outside Portsmouth, to floggings, with some of the ringleaders sentenced to 600 lashes on different ships and so on. So how one would survive that sort of ordeal, I do not know. But that history of extreme brutality meted out by the Admiralty and the officers was also contrasted by certain moments of successful resistance. For example, the Spithead Mutiny, which was largely about conditions, was considered, on the whole, a victory, albeit that there was some violence attending to that. And the mutineers were largely welcomed by according to the records, by the city populace, and a couple of the mutineers who died in the sort of fracas were buried in the city with kind of a reception, a crowd going out to meet the coffins and to pay their respects, with the support of the then mayor of Portsmouth, Sir John Carter, and who was kind of notably a radical Whig and sort of accused of having Republican sympathies. There were, of course, at the time accusations that the mutineers were in cahoots with the French Jacobins, and that there was a circulation of these seditious democratic ideas going on at the time. The later subsequent mutiny of the Nore, rather at an anchorage ground rather further away, was more political in intent and did indeed result in successful suppression, partly in the hanging of one of the main ringleaders, Richard Parker. But nevertheless, those kind of episodes did, historians tend to agree, have the effect, bit by bit, of improving conditions in the Royal Navy, and also proposed the idea of agency on the part of the sailors themselves. And so it is possible, I think, to kind of look at this is a very famous instance, but there are other instances of what E.P. Thompson called the moral economy of the English crowd, whereby ordinary townspeople, ordinary working class people would band together and use really force of numbers to try and bargain for example, better bread and flour prices during the period of the Corn Laws, and would also protest against racist treatment of people in the town as well. So we can possibly recuperate from these histories of resentment, history from below, which counteracts the image of a kind of universally loyal and obedient military personnel, as I'm sure many people who, like me, have experience of military life vicariously, in the case of my father, who taught on a US Air Force Base school in East Anglia, can attest, I think. So there is good reason to contest the kind of the idea that that you know, loyalty, utter loyalty, is part of the whole package of being in Portsmouth as a significantly Royal Naval town. And some of the images that we can look at, you know, for example, and I'll just show some brief examples here, you know, from the ways that you can begin to, can you see that image of the art gallery, Tom?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so walking around this exhibition currently with the students, we can see these kind of rather idealized images of Portsmouth in the late 18th and early 19th century. This image, I'm afraid it's not larger, I'm sorry, but of Portsmouth Point, showing the kind of commercial bustle, peaceful, tranquil waters, honeyed sky, very typical of the kind of celebratory, almost Venetian sort of images of Canaletto, and you know, with the nice sort of perspective lines here, and commerce going on in a peaceful and tranquil way. And these other images here, where Portsmouth was somewhere that attracted painters in particular because of the kind of military, because of the naval bustle and the maritime bustle and stuff going on, but also then recuperating as well a kind of equally problematic but very different image of a kind of rambunctious crowd of sailors, the famous image of Portsmouth Point by Thomas Rowlandson that you can see here. And ways of kind of getting into the, you know, if you like, the diversity, albeit with a anti-Semitic stereotype here of Moses Levy, Jewish moneylender, sort of looking out of the window to entrap the indebted sailors here, or the, you know, this kind of image of kind of carousing and leering and aggressive women pouncing upon the menfolk and so on, and the bawdy houses here and so on. This kind of equally rambunctious and problematic sort of stereotypical image of the English crowd one can look between those images and see something that is altogether sort of more humane and more challenging of power structures and authorities from within the very belly of the military history itself. So teachable moments, perhaps, and ways of recuperating a democratic impulse, I think, from histories that are often, not always, and all credit to the Royal Naval Museum, it does have a section on the Spithead mutinies and Nore mutinies, but one can recuperate histories from which we can learn in terms of challenging authority.
Excellent. Thank you, Marius, for that fantastic sort of deep dive into the history from below of Portsmouth, and, you know, as you say, what we can learn that dissents from certain kind of dominant narratives that have been pushed. So I don't know if people, we've got some time for Q&A and commentary. I mean, I'd be interested personally to hear other people's sort of experiences of maybe trying to address these sorts of issues in the classroom or with colleagues or in whatever sort of institutional context. I mean, I could read, there's a comment here from Helen, thank you, where she says, the Board of Governors has staff and student governors who are involved in senior appointments, which is a useful bit of information. Kim, I think this is a response, Kim Bard, but our committees are often not independent of each other, with many overlapping members, and many are chaired by a relatively limited number of the upper level management team. I'm not nearly important enough to get invited to these sorts of meetings, so I'm not sure if I can comment, but I was aware, yes, of staff and student governors who sort of co-opted onto the board. I mean, I think I've found that through looking it up. I don't know whether people have thoughts about whether that's enough, whether people are sort of satisfied with that, or whether I kind of, my own feeling, for what it's worth, is that if we have democratic processes outside of the university, why can't we have them inside the university? I mean, in the way that Collini talks about, you know, I mean, as someone who's worked here for some years, I can think of a number of real problems. I'm not going to obviously get into details about them, but real conflicts within, you know, my faculty and school that I think probably could have been averted if there had been a bit more democracy, you know, sort of clashes between personalities and factions that, you know, because I think even if there is, if someone gets into a position of power and there are complaints about that situation, then at least they have the moral authority of saying, well, look, I won an election, you know, like that there was a kind of a free and fair process. Whereas if they haven't, if they seem to have been parachuted into that position, then I wonder, you know, it then becomes, you know, not such an easy thing to defend, maybe. I don't know. In my view. So Kim, you've put your hand up. Is that, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm getting my camera very good. It's, yeah, I'm going to forget the camera. I'm just going to say something.
Please, yeah.
So I came from American institutions where academics, at least within the department, took on the role of head begrudgingly, and it rotated. And everybody knew that after their term as head of department, for instance, they would be coming back within the ranks. And so this sense of, you know, you have to treat people pretty fairly was inculcated, because you knew that, you know, it was going to come back on you if you put, you know, drastic burdens of work on people, that it just wasn't going to be fair in the long run for everybody if you did that. So I was really surprised here when it seemed like a head of department was a position, a godlike position, where, and once appointed, there's more and more and more encouragement to maintain that role. And I don't know, I mean, I've been here 22 years, so I don't have the whole history, but never has a head of department come back into the ranks. Head of department either goes up or goes somewhere else. And so all of the upper management systems all go up, and you can't afford to question anybody's power or authority higher than you, because you depend on them for your next step, because it's always up. So I'm wondering, can we really think about changing the British academic system so dramatically? I would be all for it, but I just don't see how it's possible. It seems to be so ingrained. If you have a complaint, even within your department, you have to complain to the head of department. But if your complaint is with the head of department, there's no other route for you to complain. So it seems like these power systems are really very firmly in place and very unidirectional.
Thank you, Kim. I think that's a really cogent point. Very well made. Marius, you've got your hand up. I wonder if that's because you wanted to respond to Kim, or?
Well, yes. Thank you, and I would wholeheartedly agree. I don't think it's quite accurate to generalize about the British higher education system as being like that, because many universities that I've experienced, as either external examiner or whatever, or working at myself, do tend to have a more rotational coming back into the ranks arrangement, usually after about 3 or 4 years, maybe 3 years, and then you get a year's sabbatical or something to pay for your pains, and then you come back into the ranks. So it is a way of keeping a check on overweening ambition, I think, and a check on power. But that doesn't, I do agree, it's somewhat surprising that doesn't happen at this institution. Whether it's a feature of the post-92 universities, that may be the case. Others could perhaps enlighten me on that. But I completely agree that that is a model that seems to work reasonably well elsewhere, because people have energy when they come into the role, and so on. So yes, and your analysis, I think, is excellent.
Yeah. There's a comment from Greta again, another really good point. There's work to be done on reading lists to support the diverse curriculum. Humanities are beginning to look at this, a small thing, but a positive step. I agree. Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Greta, because you're obviously in a very good position to.
Okay, well, it's quite interesting, really, because in trying to do this from the library point of view, what you clearly notice is publishing is behind in publishing books by diverse or authors from diverse backgrounds. But it's kind of trying to find other ways to populate reading lists, maybe journal articles, maybe even web resources. We spend a lot of time talking about publication process, and the publication processes themselves don't really kind of fit with what's required at this moment in time. So it's thinking more about other sources rather than traditional sources as well. So it's quite a deep topic, I think, but something that people are beginning to look at, and reading lists are quite kind of out there. They're there for everyone to see. And I think working with students in architecture as well, and inviting them to submit topic areas and authors and architects' names to try and build the collection. But they're quite quiet in coming forward, actually. So, it's kind of a joined up approach with people who know about the topic and students who care enough to share the information, I suppose, or confident enough to share the information, perhaps.
Absolutely.
I tend to agree that word confidence actually came to mind when when Tom was speaking, and also in some of the chat, in relation to the chat. I mean, it's fine to have it depends on it's about the limits of representation and how much you're prepared to challenge accepted narratives, ideologies, ways of doing things. And I think there is often an assumption that the institutional traditions, as it were, or ideologies are not really up for discussion, and the challenge will sometimes result in punishment rather than either implicit or otherwise, rather than having a view that challenge is good and healthy for an institution and for our society, and an idea of challenge as part of the normal way of doing things, and having the confidence to tackle ideas and practices and so on, which I think is some way of actually developing that. And that's why what Tom was saying about sort of proposing devil's advocate scenarios and so on like this, and tackling controversial and difficult questions, and having the sheer neck to do that, and in fora which aren't just safe spaces, like the trade union or something like that, but actually doing it in arenas, combat, if you like, and developing those, that confidence, I think, is important. So it's no good having student representatives or so on committees unless they actually speak up, and staff representatives, and so on. And I think that remains a thing to try and achieve.
I suppose all of these issues sort of connect together, don't they, in very intimate and complex ways. I mean, my thoughts about the diversifying the curriculum is that it's very much closely connected to decisions made about staff hires and decisions about how you build an academic department to reflect the full range of sort of theoretical approaches. I mean, I was quite fortunate as an undergraduate. I did English literature, and I felt I came away with a pretty good grounding in literatures from other parts of the world, post-colonial approaches, Marxist approaches, queer theory, feminism, because there had been, some, like a kind of democratic, transparent sort of approach maybe to building a department, to hiring and balancing out disciplines and interests and things in that way. It's about sort of choices that are made to hire, at the top, as well as kind of pressure from below, I suppose, isn't it, to achieve that sort of diversity in all those areas. Fiona says, in AcDev, we're currently building our EDI website. One of our resources is a decolonizing database. It's still early stages and built without the content specialism, but it may be of some use. Thanks for the link there. That's great. Don't know if you wanted to say any more about that, Fiona, or whether you had any thoughts.
There's not too much more to say at the moment, but with the team who put on today, coordinated it, but we're working on the website at the moment, so once it's all put together and built, we can share that more broadly, but we've got quite a broad range of things. So we try to do it for each faculty, generally for each school, to look at some things around decolonizing and looking at different perspectives. But because we're not specialists in engineering, whatever topic, we've done the best we can, and then some more broad general things in there as well. So it's just an example of some very early kind of papers and things that might be useful to look at within your specific disciplines or generally around decolonizing.
Thank you. That's great. That's a great resource for people looking at. Is that? Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, I was just thinking in relation to what you were saying about English literature. So. For example, one of my son's friends, son's at Oxford, and one of his friends is doing English, and she had to do. So they've got 15 weeks of lectures and classes, tutorials on Milton. So one, 17th century English poet, and I'm just like, so what does that say about other literatures and things like this? So I mean. I suppose I would, on the one hand, I'd be cautious about congratulating ourselves on this sort of thing. But I think some universities are further ahead than others, for sure. I mean, I don't know exactly what else is going on in the curriculum, at the ancient universities, but I suspect there's still a lot of reform to happen.
Yeah, Kim, you got.
Yeah, it's a bit surprising, but under the context of doing some work to help decolonizing the curriculum, people are getting quite strong negative reactions from people. Not a lot of people, but the reactions from those that have them are really hostile and aggressive.
From students?
No, staff.
Mm.
Really? I mean, can you tell us more without obviously approaching sensitive information? I mean, I'd just be interested to know how people could object, really. But
well, so I got sent a video of it's kind of one of these propaganda videos of a really nice looking guy talking in somewhat reasonable terms, saying how the decolonization theory wants to cancel all the wonderful things that we've already got and replace them with something horrific, but they don't ever specify that. And it's like a 15-minute video of propaganda. I mean, about those people who want to decolonize. And this was, I mean, I said, I endorse our decolonizing efforts. And I got sent this email with a video.
Is this one of those sort of campus pressure groups that I think have come? I was reading about this.
This was just a person,
right?
And the other one's just something somebody told me that they got. They got a lot of really aggressive comments back from a survey that they were doing. Things like, if the university is going to decolonize, I'm going to quit. I mean, I'm kind of like, well, bye, but but really strong, aggressive anti-colonization of the curriculum, which just doesn't make any sense to me.
I mean, I've had similar experiences, but maybe not specifically in the context of decolonizing the curriculum. I mean, in terms of microaggressions towards me when I've sort of, I'm white passing, but when I've sort of mentioned that I have, I'm of Jewish heritage, I've had comments from that, I was sort of shocked to hear inside a university, that very kind of primitive sort of beliefs, that you might expect more to find down the pub, being on the end of those sorts of things. I've overheard lots of sort of, what you might call kind of microaggressive, subtle, racist comments. This is something that, Marius, you and I have talked about in the past as part of other sorts of programs. And again, I suppose is that something, my experience of other universities, I don't think it would be so likely that you would come across that kind of dodgy discourse, because I think of all sorts of material reasons, I go back to what I was saying about, the sort of location of this university within a very militarized, very reactionary, very conservative city for the most part. That's obviously, as Marius has rightly argued, there's obviously always been dissent to that, and that's important to remember. But I think, the last university I saw the inside of that wasn't Portsmouth was Goldsmiths in southeast London, in a very, 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 very different sort of demographic and social context, very diverse location outside of the university and very diverse within the university. There wasn't a day when, quite enjoyably for me, when I'd go up, I was doing my PhD there, and I'd go up, get off the train and walk up, and almost every day there was a sort of student demonstration for some social justice issue. I don't think I've ever seen students demonstrate at Portsmouth, and so, and I guess there's a whole host of reasons for that, that are geographical and material and historic. So how we go about changing that, I don't know. I mean, I think we have to start somewhere, and conversations like this would be useful, finding allies, and it's, I'm really pleased that we've had a good turnout here today, and I'm not suggesting that everyone is necessarily going to agree on everything all the time, but there clearly seems to be some interest in trying to progress things a little bit. Well, can I just ask you, Kim, where you're a lecturer? or
A professor? Yeah.
Sorry,
I'm a professor in psychology.
Professor of psychology. Okay, right. Interesting.
And we've got great documentation about how psychology is predominantly based in Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic samples. I mean, in all different aspects of psychology. So you'd think that within psychology, there would be this real desire to embrace humanity, to be more inclusive, to include samples of diverse, I mean, actually to decolonize the curriculum. Maybe not, I'm not competent to do any kind of historical decolonization, but I can, within my subject matter, say, this is what you'll get in a textbook, but it is such a small slice of humans that we have to consider all of these other things. And the real picture is probably something quite different than what you might get in a textbook. And the students appreciate it, although they say it's a whole lot more work. I wish you'd just teach us what's in the textbook. But they do appreciate both the need for it and how well it does the job.
Good. Excellent. Okay. Well,
I appreciate the conversation a lot. I think it's really, really helpful. And I love the extra resources that we have from.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, people have chipped in very well. And just mentioned Thomas Langston. Good name, Thomas. I like it. Mentioning the David Baddiel book, examples of small racism, Jews don't count, which I read, not without its flaws, I would say, but a pretty good book.
I mean, he's a problematic figure, though, isn't he? Because he's part of the kind of what some have criticized him for being racist himself, haven't they?
Yeah.
When he dressed up in blackface and so on to mock a footballer.
The problem of
I don't think he's particularly sympathetic to Palestinians and so on.
No, this is worth pointing out. People are saying they have to go. I think actually, Marius, you and I have to go to another meeting.
Yes, indeed.
We will. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming on. We were a bit scared about this. We weren't sure if anyone would be remotely interested, but clearly people are. It'd be great to stay in touch. We'll make a recording of this available somehow, somewhere. And yes, and perhaps we can sort of do something like this again, and have more input from you guys. Make this make this a panel perhaps, or something like this. Structure it in that way. Brilliant. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Have a good rest of the day.